Mr. President, Mr. Ilves, also from my side, welcome back to the Sacred Hall of Security Policy, back to Munich. And before we start about talking about digital security stuff, I'd like to begin with conventional physical security issues. Back in 2007, you also were sitting here in the ballroom. It was your second year as president of Estonia, and it was also the moment, in fact it was in February, when President Putin delivered his inflammatory speech in this hall and literally opened the first chapter of Russian aggression in Europe. And this time only a few people took the speech seriously. It was you, your counterparts from Eastern Europe, who warned of an increasingly aggressive Russia. In retrospect, what could the West have been done better?
Well, listen to Central and East Europeans a little more. But to this day. Let me start saying that I don't know how you chose the date, but yesterday was the 15th anniversary also of the removal of a Bronx statue in Tallinn, which 15 years ago today was then followed by the first, to anyone's, well, I mean, publicly known, state-on-state DDoS attack. Before, there had been all kinds of things that qualified as cyber attacks. I mean, Moonlight Mile and all these things that happened before, but those are always kept kind of quiet. But on April 28th, 2007, we woke up and many of our services were down. Banks were down, newspapers were down, government sites were down, and it was it was clear it was a DDoS attack. Though I didn't much know about DDoS attacks, but I quickly found out. What's interesting about it when we talk about cyber is that if you take von Clausewitz's definition of war, which is the continuation of policy by other means, this was clearly, precisely, a Clausewitzian defined war. And I guess one of the other things that is sort of resonates here with the Putin speech right up there is that when we went to NATO to say we had the cyber attack, people, no one believed us. They didn't even know what it was. And some countries, I guess, wouldn't know, at that time at least, wouldn't have known a laptop from a toaster oven. So it was hard to get this across to people. Skipping ahead just to do a little bit of history, 2011 is my memory, but maybe you remember 2010. But 2011 was the, to quote Joe Nye, quoting me, Joe Nye wrote an op-ed in the IHT saying, the Munich Security Conference held its first panel discussion on cybersecurity, to which someone from a small East European country, that was me, said, this is the first one, but it won't be the last. So at least I've got something right. In any case, just to bring it up to date, I just published with the Munich Security Conference an article which I would say Ukraine has proved completely wrong, though I think that it still has a little bit of truth to it. In which I claim that with the end of the second millennium, or the end of the 20th century, we really saw we're up to the end of the 20th century. All conflict had been kinetic, I mean, with kind of minor exceptions. But what we have seen since the beginning of the 21st century is that conflicts are digitally based, which changes the entire nature of conflict and war, I would say, because if you remember your Newton's second law, force equals mass times acceleration, which is equivalent to distance divided by time squared. Well, once you get into the digital or cyber realm, there is no mass, not to speak of. There is no distance on Earth to speak of, nor any notable time. And so that means that in turn, which we can talk about, completely changes the nature of what geopolitics is about.
But you still need tanks.
Well, as I said, I blew it on that one. But one of the things, yes, that everyone has noticed is the minimal role played by cyber attacks in the Ukraine conflict on the part of Russia, which has a considerable history of doing all kinds of things, and not only DDoS and hacking and doxing, but actually hitting critical infrastructure with colonial oil in the United States. So, I mean, it's there. And certainly we also have enough indications of the Russians scouting transatlantic fiber optic cables and other things. So, but what I think, my thesis is the reason why you haven't seen it is that the other half of cyber, as it were, is that it is a great equalizer. That Ukraine may not have, it may have a third of the number of people. It may have far fewer tanks. But when it comes to cyber, they can hit back. And I think that, well, as we've seen, there's been considerable hacking on the part of the Ukrainians. So, yes, we have tanks, but I think we also have not seen cyber to its full extent, possibly because there is some kind of some balance there, and they said, well, maybe we shouldn't go too far with this because the Ukrainians actually are not nearly as outnumbered in cyber as they are in kinetic war.
Thank you. Before we come later again to this topic, once you described April 2007 when you faced this huge cyber attack on Estonia. You described that once as a blessing for Estonia. Why?
Pardon me?
You described the 2007 attack as a blessing for Estonia.
Well, it was a blessing because actually we had been petitioning NATO to open a center of excellence for cyber. Now, NATO, just so for those who are not NATO, at least at that time, I guess, had 80 or 81 centers of excellence on different topics. For example, at that time, at least in Kiel, here in Deutschland, there was a center of excellence for operations in closed and shallow waters, which is a pretty specific topic, but it was a center of excellence. Yet there was none for cyber, and we had been for 3 years. We've been saying, "Come on, this is going to be an issue we need to do." So, in a sense, it was a blessing because at that point NATO took it far more seriously, and we ended up opening the center in Tallinn, Center of Excellence in Tallinn for cyber.
You just mentioned colonial pipeline. We had also incidents in the past. Take, for instance, SolarWinds, which was really devastating. We are, in times of war, we are in a permanent casus belli in cyberspace. If we look forward, how do we have to react on that? With comprehensive hackbacks, cyber sanctions?
Well, this is one of the most argued and difficult issues, is do you do hackbacks or not? And up till now, most governments do not allow hackbacks because of all the different problems that can happen. I mean, the first one is obviously what happens if it's a false flag operation? And then that too is something which in the cyber world, you can very easily do a false flag attack, which is much more difficult if you're on if you're attacking Mariupol. It's probably not it's not Saudi Arabia doing that. Whereas, or Iran, say, but in cyber, we could easily imagine false flag attacks, so that's something that's been tricky. And in general, it's not generally been done, at least in the public sector. I don't know, a private sector might have some other ideas about that, but I don't know.
Maybe we learn more about that today. From the private sector, maybe we learn more about that today, about possible hackbacks. But
well, then you'd have the equivalent of the Wagner mercenary group involved too, right? I guess, I mean.
But yeah, you rightly mentioned the Wagner group. Let's take a look again on Russia, state-sponsored hacking, especially that what we see from Russia has always or is always usually mostly carried out by an unholy alliance of state agencies and organized crime actors. How can we drain this swamp? Maybe if we separate both groups, take a different look on that.
Well, I think our response needs to be very different, not in the particular technology used to approach them, but I mean, what we see on the Russian side is a continuum of activities, beginning with the most basic kinds of cyber attacks of hacking, but then moving on to DDoS, moving on to then coming out of hacking, doxing, which we saw especially in the 2016 US elections, also an attempt of using hacked materials in 2017 and the previous presidential election in France, to disinformation. I mean, and these are, I mean, I hate to talk about the Gerasimov doctrine, because I'm not really thinking it's a doctrine, but the Russia does use a continuum of these various tools that are all a function one way or another of the digital world that didn't exist 20 years ago. Even disinformation, sure, it existed, so I mean, the Trojan horse is disinformation, but I mean, if you think about how this fake story about the U.S. inventing AIDS, it took 6 years to get from a communist newspaper, provincial newspaper in India to the German press. I mean, it travels slowly. Now all these things come out constantly. But the point is that not so much what they do, but what we don't do. We do not cooperate. There's a little bit with the Five Eyes, but as of Brexit, Europe is not even touched by Five Eyes. But if you look at what the attackers are doing, I mean, basically the two fundamental Russian groups, APT-28 and APT-29, have attacked the State Department, the DOD, the Senate or the Congress, the Bundestag, the Stiftungen in Berlin. They've attached the Dutch foreign ministry. They've done the Italian foreign ministry, and on top of, and as an instrument of state policy, they've even done WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency. So they don't care. I mean, and we look at this. I mean, our problem is that not only do we not sort of do things across disciplines, but we don't do anything across borders. Every single country has its own thing, and we don't, again, with the exception of Five Eyes, we're not talking very much. I mean, the Dutch actually have been doing some stuff, but in general, we don't. And, I mean, a good example of that is when we discovered in Estonia a worm. It was about 2011 or so, a Russian worm in our military network, and we went to NATO and said, look, we discovered this worm. And NATO's response was, oh, you too. This is not the proper response. So I think that, I mean, I'm told that things have improved since that time. But nonetheless, my point is that we do need to take these things, I mean, we need a hell of a lot more cooperation across borders than we have, and we have very little of it. So that would be my take on it.
Indeed, you are advocating for even a longer time for a system of collective security. In that sense, maybe also this day is very symbolic. Today, as far as I know, Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the US will launch a new initiative, a sort of declaration for the future of the Internet, outlining a series of democratic principles. First, that sounds, of course, good, but I wonder, is that enough? Is it really enough? Do we need better a cyber NATO or something like that?
Well, I mean, I think we have to go look beyond something like NATO, because recall that NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, not that we are also wonderful in this region, though we are, of course, but nonetheless, it's because of bomber range, fighter refueling, tank transport, troop logistics. That's why it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and that's why Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and Australia and New Zealand are not in NATO. People say, why aren't they in NATO? Well, that's because we keep thinking about common values, and those states do have common values, but we are restricted actually by geography. Now, when we get to the cyber realm, as I said, you eliminate mass, you've eliminated distance, you've eliminated time as an element, which means that, I love this, Tallinn, Torino, Toronto, and Tokyo are all, and Toledo, I guess I should put in there too, to keep Americans happy, and Tokyo are all equidistant. There is no, I mean, there are microseconds in difference in an attack on any of those cities. Now, if that is the case, then maybe we should come up with some other way of grouping countries based on values, so that you would cover all of those that I mentioned, but other democracies as well. I mean, Uruguay is actually fairly developed digitally. And it's a fine liberal democracy. Why don't we invite Uruguay, too? And of course, NATO does have a few problems I won't get into for political correctness reasons, with some countries in NATO that perhaps don't always match the values of the purported values of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But I would very much like to see something moving in this direction that would allow far more cooperation. Okay, it won't be Five Eyes, but seriously, let's not have events such as, oh, you discovered that too, anymore. I mean, that's the kind of thing we want to get away from. We're also getting away from time.
Yeah, I think the organizers would allow 2-3 more minutes, because it's really nice to talk to you. Mr. President, if we take another look, data. Data is also a huge issue, and you once wrote, the real issue with Big Brother is not so much the state collecting data as our own behavior.
Well, actually, I said the real problem is the little sister who knows everything about you and tells everybody else, which is what I sort of coined to talk about Facebook, which basically, I mean, as we all know, ever since 2016, I mean, they're sucking up all our data and they're selling it, and that's the little sister. And the state actually does fairly little, and in fact, there are considerable mechanisms you can employ. For example, in Estonia, on any of the systems that we have that are based on the state system, we have reciprocal mutual transparency, so I can see whoever's looking at my data. And if they're looking at the wrong things, they get arrested. But in any case, data, the other thing I mentioned about data is that there has been, especially in Europe, especially in this country, an obsession with privacy, which I have nothing really about I don't really have anything against privacy, but I think we're looking at the wrong issue. We should be looking at data integrity, which is far more crucial. Data, I mean, privacy is someone publishes my blood type or my bank account. You know, could be embarrassing, blood type, who cares? if someone changes the record of my blood type, or someone changes my bank account, and certainly probably not for the better, that is a problem, and we need to pay far more attention to data integrity than we have. And so when we talk about data, instead of obsessing about privacy, I would like to see a far greater concern on data integrity. Though, of course, data privacy is important too, since we see places with weak cybersecurity, be it the private sector like the Equifax hack, or the state sector like with the OPM hack that was, I don't know, 20-odd million federal employees, past and present, including psychological profiles of CIA agents, all held in one database and in clear text, not even encrypted. I mean, this shows that states need to think a lot more.
Yeah, it's ironic that right now Elon Musk is acquiring Twitter for $44 billion US dollar. He could have downloaded the app for free, of course. But, we are unfortunately running out of time. Maybe one very brief question, as we also should take a look on Germany's role in cyberspace. And after all, we really like to lecture others. But on the other hand, that makes a view of our country from outside all the more valuable. What's your point of view? What's your perspective on Germany and its cybersecurity achievements and strategies?
Well, I think every country ultimately will have to will need to develop a strong state-run, most likely robust system that it would have three components. One is a secure digital, everyone would have a secure, unique digital identity, and then that would communicate with end-to-end encryption and with minimally two-factor authentication. Then which is slowly coming into existence in Europe. It's not required, but it's urged. With the ADAS directive, it doesn't exist in the United States at all, even though I think they've missed a lot of opportunities to do that. Then secondly, you need to really impose a distributed architecture, so you don't have a repeat of the OPM hack, but more broadly that you don't store it all in one place as an elementary cybersecurity thing. And the last thing is, of course, guaranteeing data integrity. So in my country, all critical data, including all citizens' health care data, all laws, because if you think about what happens if someone changed the laws or something, are on a permission blockchain. So those are things that need to be done. Now, when you ask about Germany, the problem is that you need to make this minimally sort of national. I mean, the problem in Germany is you have 16 Länder. And if each one has its system, I mean, whenever I talk to people who deal with these issues in Germany, when I say, well, you know, this is something that would be really good to do, they go, well, you don't understand. We have 16 Länder and we all have different systems. And I go, especially since what our ultimate goal should be is that at least some of these services should be cross-border in the European Union. For example, I mean, our digital prescription, which we have in Estonia, works with works mutually with Finland, and bizarrely enough, Portugal and Croatia. I mean, why that happens, much of that is legal rather than technical, but nonetheless, we need to be moving in that direction. And so the first challenge, I would say, for Germany is to at least get a national system going.
Thank you so much. A lot of food for thought for this afternoon. Thank you. That was President Toomas Ilves from Estonia. Thank you so much that you took the time to travel to Munich to speak to us. Thank you.